would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which I live and work, the Gundungurra land, and people. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. I also want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which you, our listeners, are joining us from today. I recognise the deep connection that First Nations people have to this land, their enduring culture, and their commitment to the preservation and care for their country. This land was never ceded, and it always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Hey there, and welcome to Beyond the Surface, the podcast where we explore the stories of people who have survived religious trauma, left high control or cult communities, and are deconstructing their faith. I'm your host, Sam, and each week I'll talk with individuals who have taken the brave step to start shifting their beliefs that might have once controlled and defined their lives. Join us as we dig into their experiences, the challenges they've faced, and the insights they've gained. Whether you're on a similar journey or you're just curious about these powerful stories, you're in the right place. This is Beyond the Surface. Welcome, Kit. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm so excited about this episode because I just love talking to other queer people, and I like talking about queer issues, and so that is a little hint as to what today's episode is about, which is a little bonus episode on the experience of cognitive dissonance, in particular for the queer community. But I thought, let's start at the foundation. Can you explain what cognitive dissonance is?
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to break up the two words. So cognitive goes back to cognition. So cognition is our thought patterns, belief systems, values that can come from that. And then dissonance is incongruence. So whenever we have different thoughts, values, belief systems that end up being incongruent and at odds with each other, that's whenever we have cognitive dissonance. And that can affect our behaviors, our relationships, and our emotions.
Mhm. I love I often use the word contradiction, but I like the word like incongruence. I like that term. I think that's a really good way of explaining it. Okay, so in terms of cognitive dissonance for a queer person, what does that look like?
Like with part of this and looking at cognitive dissonance, I think that there can be a lot of different facets of cognitive dissonance for queer folks.
Mm.
And a lot of this can go back to societal pressures or family pressures as well,
Mm.
or also just lack of education, how heteronormative education is. So if we look at like all of these foundational experiences, and if there's lack of representation, and if there's kind of this, being forced into heteronorms
Mm.
whenever you're not hetero, then that makes it really complicated.
Yeah.
So then you're at odds with how you were conditioned versus, what your authentic self is.
Mm. And so if we take it a step deeper in terms of layer, there is, like you said, societal pressures and family pressures and conditions. But there is a particular uniqueness for those who are raised in organized religion.
hmm Yeah, absolutely. And I think with part of this, a, a lot of this I think goes back to gender identity and gender constructs. And so a lot of, and I mean, I can speak about it from a Christianity type
Mm.
standpoint, rather than from organized, like other organized major religions.
Yeah.
But from a Christian standpoint, it's very binary,
Mm.
and there's these very set gender rules and constructs. And and part of this, it's looking at, okay, so if you're going to be a quote unquote good girl or a good boy, then you need to follow these prescribed rules. And if you don't follow this, well, then you're not in alignment with God. And whenever you're not in alignment with God, then there's different consequences that could even lead to eternal damnation from Christian theology. And so if you look at that, and if you're like, well, I don't really fit into this, then
Mm.
it's like, well, then where do I belong in this? And with part of the gender identity and the gender constructs within Christianity, there's also sexual orientation that
Mm.
they weave into that. And there is queer erasure
Mm.
whenever the biblical scriptures are taught in Christian settings. But if you really like peel back the layers, you're like, maybe the Bible is more queer than what it was taught, you know?
Oh boy, that is a rabbit hole that we could jump down that would probably I feel like that would end up with us getting roasted on social media. But I would agree with you. And yeah, I think and I mean we also see that in terms of like queer theology and things like that in embracing that as well. But for I guess in your in America, it would be largely evangelical Christianity, I would anticipate. We don't tend to use the word evangelical in Australia, but it is synonymous with Pentecostalism and things like that. And basically, like you said, it's just super, super rigid binary in not just gender and sexuality, but literally everything that, and everything is fear-based submission to avoid hell, essentially. Um,
Mhm.
but okay, so what does that cognitive dissonance look like in reality? What sort of thoughts, beliefs, what does it look like for somebody who is at war with themselves, essentially?
So, if we're looking at it from a cognitive dissonance standpoint, that's based in the Christian religion, part of this could look like, say, attending a church that maybe you're going to that church because you're like, well, this was a church that I was raised in. This is where my family goes. This is where my friends go, or I know someone who's serving in this church there. However, maybe that church doesn't allow queer couples to get married there. Maybe that church doesn't allow openly queer people to be in leadership at that church. But
Mm.
then continuing to go to that church, even if you know deep down that you're queer.
Mm.
And so I think that that's something that unfortunately is a very common queer experience whenever being brought up in Christianity. And part of this too is avoiding loss.
Mm.
And so, in this avoidance of loss, there is loss. There's a loss of a sense of self
Mm.
whenever going through the cognitive dissonance of, you know, being pulled in one direction of your thoughts of, well, I want to be involved in this church and, because of my faith or because of my community, but then also in acknowledging, well, I can't fully be my authentic self in this space. So what even does community mean for
Mm.
me whenever being in this space?
Mm. It makes me that pull either side makes me I often will give the imagery of my own experience of it's almost like I have one foot on either side of the Grand Canyon, just trying to have both sides, you know, pull me in their direction. But what happens is that I don't really get pulled in either direction. I just get ripped apart from like in the middle. And so
Mhm.
it is soul destroying, I think, for people to try and stay in that place of one foot in, one foot out, essentially. It's yeah, it's an incredibly painful experience, I think.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Speaking of having your insides be ripped apart, I know that that's a very ominous
I'm like,
segue here.
transition.
Oh my goodness. But in working as a therapist primarily with LGBTQ folks, there is a disproportionate amount of LGBTQ folks, at least from what I've seen in my practice, of folks who have GI conditions or have autoimmune conditions.
Mm,
And, there's that phrase, the body keeps a score, and that's very true. So if you're experiencing all this cognitive dissonance, like that is going to be affecting your insides,
mm,
literally. And so, if you're taught to push things down and suppress it, like, you know, there's these churches that are considering to themselves to be more progressive and saying, well, it's okay to be gay, just don't act on it. But then what does that lead to? That can lead to a lot of inner turmoil, and it can cause distress, it can cause inflammation, which can lead to, gastrointestinal conditions as well as autoimmune conditions. Um, and so I think that that's something important to recognize as well, because although there may be, again, this avoidance of loss by staying in different environments, there is loss that can lead to long-term losses
mm.
with staying in these environments.
Yeah. I guess, if you push something down enough and suppress something down enough, it is going to come out in other ways, right? And
Mhm.
we do often see that come out in terms of physical health battles, symptoms, whatever terminology you want to use. Um, in terms of your work as a therapist, what do you see in the queer folk that you work with in terms of how this plays out for them? What does it look like for them?
I think it really depends upon a person's background.
Mm,
And I grew up in what is considered in the US to be called the Bible Belt. And so it is this stretch of land in the US where there is a lot of influence of evangelicalism in public policies there and in culture and societal norms.
mm,
And so it really shapes life even outside of the church and outside of religious spaces.
mm,
But I'm now based in the state of New York, which is not the Bible Belt.
mm,
So that's very interesting. So all of the clients that I see are New Yorkers.
mm,
So if people grew up in New York and are queer, they're going to have a much different experience than someone that grew up in another part of the US and
mm.
then moved to New York. So I think because of this, there are not as much collective queer experiences depending upon geography.
Mm,
Like there is a sense of geographic privilege that
mm,
can come. So I do see a lot of diversity of experiences in
mm.
working with queer folks rather than seeing collective experiences because of how vastly different public policies can be in different areas of the US.
Yeah. And I think that that's probably, that geographical privilege is probably really important to note because I think regardless of where you are in the world, queerness does tend to be politicized, and identity and gender and sexuality is used in policies. But in some countries, it is more prominent than others. And you guys in the US, it is like I every time I speak to somebody in the US, I go like, oh, it is just a shit show over there. Like, and I sit here in Australia feeling for you guys as you go into your next election and things like that, where not just in the church, but your politics is enmeshed in religion, essentially, and so the two are almost synonymous with one another. Um, that's incredibly complex and layered for a queer person in that environment, right?
Yeah, definitely. I ended up joining a community choir because after leaving the church, I really missed communal singing.
Mm,
And um, and so it's mostly straight folks who are in the choir, and we practice in a local high school, but we weren't able to practice in the local high school yesterday, so we ended up practicing in a local church.
mm,
And this I hadn't stepped foot in a church in over a year
mm,
since going in there, and then in going in there, I saw, some different things where I was like, oh, that's kind of interesting, and seeing that again where there's, the chairs with the upholstery where
mm,
it's in blood red crimson,
mm,
just to remind you about the blood of Jesus Christ. And then there is an American flag, and then what's called the Christian flag, which is white, and then it has like a blue square in the corner with a red cross because again, blood.
mm.
And I'm wondering, in Australia, is that something common to be seeing like a national flag in a church?
Not at a church, no. You will
Okay.
see, yeah, you'll see that like our Australian flag, like at government buildings and things like that, and you'll see some who have an Australian flag flying in their at their home who are I'm trying to find a really polite way of saying they tend to be, I guess, our equivalent of white supremacists. They
Mm,
are like, they're trying to sort of overtly lean into what we see from you guys in the US of that overt patriotism. But it is
mm,
not, it's not as common as what it would be for you guys, but certainly, yeah, it would not be common to have an Australian flag at a church.
mm.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, it's very common to have American flags in churches, and this what's considered to be the Christian flag in churches,
Mm,
and there's even a pledge, like how there's a pledge allegiance to the American flag, and there's a pledge allegiance to the Christian flag and to the Bible, that is used. And speaking of cognitive dissonance in the Constitution, there's in the American Constitution, there's supposed to be a separation of church and state. And so this leads to the church not being taxed. And yet, I think, and I've been to a lot of churches, I think in every church, nearly every church, maybe 98% of churches that I've been to have had American flags in churches.
wow.
Yeah, so it's very, very prevalent. And so it's like, so you see that. And so there's this indoctrination of cognitive incongruence at a very, very young age. And so there can also be like this anger that comes from Americans too, if things are not taught from a Christian perspective in Christian or in public schools, that are run by state or national governments. And so there's these different things where, it's like, okay, like this is very apparent that cognitive incongruence is kind of like this comfort blanket.
Yeah.
Um, you know,
Mm. What are some of the ways that you see or have seen in terms of personally seen, but also, I guess, heard like third party through your clients, um, in terms of the ways that faith communities have suppressed, anything that doesn't fit that heteronormative picture, because I think a lot of people tend to think that it's often really overt, and it's, and it's a preacher, speaking from the pulpit about, the evils of homosexuality and things like that. Um, but often I find that it's not always that overt. It can be really subtle. Can you sort of speak to that a little bit?
Yeah. I mean, my coming out was whenever I was in third grade and I heard the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, and I came out as a
Oh,
result of the sermon. Yeah.
right.
Um, so that was something. And now I grew up in the Baptist denomination, which is just like very widely known in the US for being very dogmatic, being very aggressive in their beliefs. So what I have experienced and what other Baptists have experienced would be different from other denominations. So like from my experience, I heard at a very, very young age of saying that if you're gay, you're going to get HIV, you're going to get AIDS, and you're going to die, and then you'll be eternally damned, and that's what you deserve. And hearing that, spoken and hearing people just saying, Amen,
Mm,
and standing up and clapping. So hearing that, knowing that this is still going on decades later,
yeah.
of calling for the death of queer people and the eternal damnation, I find that very abhorrent. And I, from what I've heard from people of other countries, it doesn't seem like this happens as much in like other countries, but this is unfortunately something that is very common still in the US.
Mm,
Um, and then like from a more overt or from a more subtle
mm,
perspective, um, part of this is again, it like goes back to, yeah, we're okay with you being gay. We accept you
mm.
as you are, but like just don't hold hands,
Yeah.
or that's your friend,
Mm,
not allowing marriages, not allowing funerals
mm,
of people that were openly queer, you know, looking at too of not allowing queer people in positions of leadership, not allowing queer people to work in the children's ministry because they assume
mm.
that queer people are quote unquote groomers.
Yeah.
So there's these different things where people may be showing up to sermons and not, seeking involvement in ministry and thinking, oh, well, they haven't said anything that was explicitly homophobic or transphobic. But whenever you ask these different questions about, like, how can I serve? How can I be involved? Then that can start bringing up some of this stuff.
Yeah.
Or, like pushing people aside, like, well, if someone asks like a question about like where does the church stand on this, we're gonna have to talk about this, I
Yeah.
we need to talk to the church board about this, and I love the show Sex Education. I think
Oh,
it's one of
yeah.
the most brilliant shows.
Mm,
And so there was the character in the show, and now I'm very bad with names, so I can't remember his name, but anyhow, so he grew up in a Nigerian church, and so he wanted to be exploring his faith more. And then he was closeted, and he decides to come out.
mm,
And the church's response is what so many people have experienced in overt homophobia,
mm.
where it's just like, well, just kind of let's just put that aside. Oh, we'll have some discussions about it, you
Yeah.
know? And to me, and in hearing, we'll have discussions about it, that is not good enough to
Mm,
me,
yeah.
because this isn't new news.
Mm,
This is stuff that has been happening for thousands of years. So people have had plenty of time to be talking about this and discussing this and figuring out what to do. But I think where churches are starting to rethink how do we repackage and repurpose this is because there are dwindling numbers of membership and of tithes,
Mm.
and churches will not be able to continue running if this continues to happen. And the more that being queer is like non-discriminated against, then the more that people are going to be leaving or decreasing tithes. And so it's going to put the church out of business if
Yeah.
they don't change.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I think that's a really good point, which is that, church is a business and it's a numbers game, whether it be numbers of people in the church or the dollars and cents kind of numbers. I think
Mhm.
the character in Sex Education is Eric, I think his name.
Yes.
Yeah, and I found there's a really interesting moment there where they decided to raise money, and the church chose not to take the donation because it was essentially a bunch of queer people who raised that money, and I think that's a really yes, it's a numbers game, but we can't be seen taking money from the wrong kind of people. And it's, I think it's really easy to think that that's, it's in a TV show and it's dramatized and things like that. But there are churches and faith communities out there who that's how they work. Um,
Mhm.
and so, yeah, I think, I mean, there are some churches in Australia, particularly Pentecostal churches and the Sydney Anglicans, who are very prominent in being anti anything that is not heteronormative, and who will, preach sermons on the sinfulness of Mardi Gras. And Mardi Gras is always a really interesting moment in Australia. But I guess my experience is probably much more subtle and things like that. So I think it's important for people to realize that this happens and it's not always super obvious, that it can happen in discussions, and in the fact that certain TV shows are not allowed to be watched, and and in the doctrine that comes out of purity culture and all of that sort of thing.
Mhm.
So, yeah, I think it's really easy to think that it's super obvious and and overt, but it's not all the time. It can, we talk about microaggressions that very much can fall into that category. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, with part of this of the subtlety, it's like, okay, so where are the tithes going to? Like, what are the ministries that they're investing in?
Mm,
What kind of language do they use? Do they use exclusive or inclusive language whenever speaking? Even, the music too.
mm,
Like, and what music is being chosen. If a church is using music from Hillsong, is that going to be an affirming church?
mm, yeah.
So there's these different things to be considering and everything where they can just be very subtle.
Mm,
But I think it's important to get curious
mm,
and ask questions. And also, with part of this of figuring out like what is going to be your tolerance
mm,
level, because you know, um, the church has been saying, wait, wait, wait for thousands of years. So, how many thousand more,
yeah.
are people going to be waiting until there's going to be change?
Mm. How have you noticed that, there are obviously some people who are very queer affirming who might not be queer themselves in terms of, uh, you know, running queer theology, and we see gay ministers and pastors and things like that. How have you noticed that some of the shifts that have happened, either good or bad, because there are shifts in either direction, some become progressive and some double down. But how have you noticed that those shifts impact the cognitive dissonance that queer people are experiencing?
I think that there can be some real positives to be able to have queer community in religious spaces, of being able to have open dialogue and having just encouragement. Also, again, communal singing. I think that communal singing can be something that, like going back to somatics, like that's something where in singing, it can be very stress relieving for people, especially in singing together
Mm.
and having, group meditation, because that's essentially what prayer is as well. That can also be healing. So there can be these different facets. And then, like, at the same point, too, like, as far as what I know at this time, I don't think that there's a Bible that, like, is actively in print right now that has fully inclusive language in
Mm.
the Bible. So then this, like, begs me to question, so then how is the preaching done to finagle its way
Mm.
around the Bible, where we know from looking at, like, linguists saying, okay, the Bible was mistranslated, to be fulfilling different propaganda. Okay, so then where's there a Bible that's not fulfilling propaganda and that is, translated in the way that it was intended
Mm.
to be translated? And so if queer folks are relying upon either queer or queer affirming ministers to be teaching them, well, then where's the autonomy in that? Like, what happens to queer folks who are not trained in theology, who are not specifically trained in queer theology, if they want to be exploring the Bible for themselves?
Mm.
And so how does that work? And so now you have queer folks that are relying upon, like, this a very, like, micro group
Mm.
of people that are queer theologians, and so then they're having to trust them. We're like, with part of this of, like, healing from religious trauma, some of this is finding your autonomy and reclaiming that.
Mm.
And so, so that makes me question, well, how how is that going to happen in
Yeah.
these spaces? I think it's possible, but there's still some more work that needs to be done, I think, to be able to really uplift that.
Yeah. Oh, that is such a good point. My first thought that came to mind is how progressive is progressive if we're still using an oppressive text to preach from.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it's like, with part of this too, like, we can be looking at this from a standpoint of us being therapists as well, because there can be dissonance in that too. Like, we can acknowledge that Sigmund Freud was an asshole,
yes, he
you
was.
know? We can acknowledge that there have been multiple harassment
Mm.
allegations against Bessel van der Kolk.
Mhm.
And so then it's like, okay, so there's these different, prominent figures in psychology, but this doesn't erase and wipe away the validity of psychology,
Yeah.
so how do we navigate in this? And I think, like, part of this too, like, this is also intertwined with theology as well. Like, um, there's that phrase, like, don't toss the baby out with the bathwater. Um, so, so with part of this, I think sometimes it can feel simpler to be like, okay, well, then we're just going to toss this out, if there's corruption in
Mm.
it. But with part of that, I think that goes back in alignment with Christian fundamentalism that teaches and conditions people to be black and white thinkers. And so how do we think in the gray
Mm.
about these different matters?
Yeah. And And I think that that's a really good point because the cognitive dissonance is not exclusive to faith communities or organized religion. It's anywhere there is, like you said, black and white thinking. And, I think we both are very well aware that, those who are coming out of religious communities or who might be deconstructing or anything like that can easily fall into just as fundamental thinking as they had when they were in the church. And yeah, that dissonance is not directly exclusive to faith communities. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, with part of this, I think like, and then being a therapist and doing mental health work, similarly to parenting,
Mm,
I think it's important to be a good role model and to really be like doing the, internal work ourselves as well. So, if we're, telling people that are in fundamentalist religion, like check yourselves, check your cognitive dissonance, and yet we're also involved in a system
yeah.
that is based upon cognitive dissonance, you know, what is that revealing?
Mm, yeah. Are there things, I guess we'll sort of, double back to those who are in faith communities and both of our backgrounds are in Christianity, so that's probably, what we will speak to. But are there things in that space that intensifies that dissonance? I mean, I think that there is probably for anybody who is queer, there is almost a baseline of that. But are there things that intensify that?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a lot of things that are coming to my mind right now. Substance use is a big one
Mm,
that intensifies cognitive dissonance, because I mean, with part of this substance misuse, it ends up affecting our cognitions. It affects our thought processes, whether we like it or not.
yeah.
And so sometimes substance use is used to either minimize, suppress, or numb
Mm,
emotions that come from the distress that has arisen from cognitive dissonance. And if that's what we're trying to do of minimize, suppressing, and numbing, well, then rather than addressing it, then it's just going to be getting bigger. So that's something that comes to mind. Also, just like familial pressures as
mm,
well, or community and friend pressures too,
mm,
where, really, really wanting to keep people close in our lives that in keeping them close, that may compromise who we are. It may compromise our safety involved as well. And so, whenever being in relationships with people that are not queer affirming, whenever you are queer, it results in a trauma response.
mm.
And so, and perpetually having trauma responses whenever being around people, um, then that's going to be really intensifying the distress and cognitive dissonance too.
Yeah. What do you explore in terms of being in the room with people who have that dissonance, in terms of ways to navigate that?
With part of this, and I know that CBT gets a bad rap.
Mm,
Um, I think part of this again goes back to black and white thinking. And with part of this, I think that it really depends upon, is the therapist doing their own work?
mm,
And are they really being collaborative with
yeah.
who they're working with? And whenever I was in grad school, I wrote a paper about why CBT doesn't work. Um, and um, and it was just kind of like, a little catching title there, but it's because the majority of people, the majority of therapists who say that they practice cognitive behavioral therapy are actually not practicing cognitive behavioral therapy.
Mm,
They're either practicing cognitive therapy or behavior therapy and not cognitive behavioral therapy. And the missing component for most CBT, and this is why it lacks effectiveness, is so anyhow, so going back to why it is not as effective is whenever a therapist doesn't use something called the Socratic method.
Mm,
And the Socratic method is so, so important whenever addressing cognitive dissonance. So that goes back to Socrates. And just like a little bit of nerding out here about Socrates is that Socrates was actually murdered. And why he was murdered was because he kept answering people's questions with other questions
mm,
and was really being evocative in different questions that he was asking, of probing like deep down, like, what does this question or what does this curiosity mean here? And I think that this is so, so important, of asking the curious questions, of getting curious, of really looking at even the words that we use. So, for instance, like a lot of times, whenever I am talking with people that are experiencing cognitive dissonance in real time, then they are using different tenses of verbs that do not match with each other,
mm,
or they are using different like pronouns that also do not match. And I don't mean this from a gender identity type standpoint. I mean this from a standpoint of a person may be talking about their friend or their significant other, and rather than saying he or she or they, they'll say you, and like almost indirecting it towards me whenever I'm not the person that they're talking about. So part of this curiosity even goes to like, what are some of these words and grammatical phrasing that is being used that brings about what is deeper
mm,
going on? So whenever people are using what I'll call like mismatched pronouns of like directing things towards me whenever I'm not the person involved, I'll ask, are you directing this towards me because you did not share this with the person that you would like to share this to, you
mm,
know? So like there's these different things where we can ask these different questions that end up probing further about these different thought patterns that I think can be so helpful whenever curbing cognitive dissonance.
yeah. I remember my own experience of therapy where I was sort of untangling this, how can I be queer with my faith? And I just remember every session would turn into me like raging out at my therapist because they just kept asking a question to my answer. And I was like, that is not what I want. That is so frustrating. And it's funny because I now do the same thing to my clients and they're like, "Will you stop asking me questions? Will you stop asking me why?" And why is a very common thing that I mean, if I had $1 for every time I said the word
Mhm,
why,
mhm,
I'd probably not work. But
mhm,
why is such a powerful question? It's super simple, but it makes you question things and it makes you go, well, what if that was different? What would that look like? And
mhm,
why are we only viewing it in this tunnel? And so I I mean, I'm probably anybody who knows me as a therapist knows that I'm probably I sit on the side of CBT gets a bad rap from me. I'm not its greatest fan. But I think any approach in therapy that's being used as a standalone is never going to benefit the
yeah,
person who is in the room. And I think that's my biggest thing, is when one thing is supposed to be the gold standard for somebody.
yes,
And I think that's the real,
absolutely.
yeah.
Oh yeah, 100%, because whenever that happens, and it's like, oh, well, this is a therapist show, like this isn't really looking at things from a collaborative type standpoint. And and part of with therapy too, like, if there's like this feeling of just like, oh, this is chill, like all the time in therapy, then that's probably not getting really deep.
Mm,
And so, there's this part of therapy that can bring discomfort, that can bring frustration, but it's like, how do we move through this together in a therapeutic relationship
mm,
that's safe? And part of this, like, it's really important to establish that sense of safety and allowing like permission for both the therapist and client to be setting boundaries in that therapeutic relationship. So there's shared power rather than looking at there being a power imbalance with
mm.
the therapist client relationship.
Yeah. Do you notice that the cognitive dissonance looks different depending on age in terms of, a 14 or 15-year-old who is in that community and there is the cognitive dissonance versus somebody who's just come out and they're 50?
Mm, mm. That's a very interesting question. From what I've seen, I have never met a client yet who has not experienced cognitive dissonance to some capacity.
Mm,
And I don't necessarily consider um, cognitive dissonance to be in different degrees of cognitive dissonance of either frequency or duration because I'm not in that person's head. That would be a little bit creepy.
mhm,
Um, and so I think just like in acknowledging that and how cognitive dissonance may express itself in different ways. Like, for instance, in working with teenagers, it can manifest more in impulsive and reckless behaviors,
mhm,
whereas with older folks, it could result more in social isolation.
mhm.
And so, part of this depends, I think, about the response
Yeah.
in the person's just developmental lifespan.
Mm. And so, if we talk about, I guess, the church's role in all of this, what to you does a inclusive and affirming church look like? Because I think back to a post that I do remember creating that was that for a queer person, a welcoming church and a safe church are not the same thing. And so, what does an inclusive and a safe and an affirming space look like in terms of faith communities?
Mhm. I think part of this is not having a power imbalance with queer folks. Queer folks who are involved in the church need to be allowed membership, they need to be allowed to participate in any kind of ministry there. They should also be allowed to have marriages and funerals there as well. I think that these facets are really important. I think that it's important for uh, biblical texts to be decoded and to really be, looking at how do we have inclusive language whenever preaching from scriptural text.
Mm,
Just like how it's become more common for churches to rather than using the words he, him whenever talking about quote unquote mankind. Now they're using the words you and they just use that as filler phrases. So, so they can use that with other phrases, they can be using different pronouns with
mm,
that. um, and and something too is like looking at how involved they're going to be in different LGBTQ work in
mm,
the community as well, and where are they going to be investing tithes and ministries into, so much of it this is done in different countries overseas because out of sight, out of mind. What about what's happening directly around folks? You know, how are they going to be helping, LGBTQ folks that are being directly impacted by policies that are homophobic or transphobic? Are they going to be helping with HIV and AIDS prevention? With what's happening in the US right now with a sweep of either proposals or past anti-LGBTQ legislation, like we really need churches to, on their marquees, be posting signs
Yeah.
about this and support. We need churches and church leaders to be showing up in mass numbers
Mm.
to these different courthouses in order to advocate for LGBTQ folks and rights. Um, you know, so there's these different things that I think are really important. I could talk about this for ages, um, but those are just some things off the top of my head.
Yeah, and I think that I think the advocacy part is really key, because I think it's really easy to think that, if they're inclusive in what they do on a Sunday morning, or at their service, that they're doing what they need to do. But I think the advocacy part and trying to actively dismantle that system of harm is what is really crucial in creating a safe and inclusive environment, because this is not a singular church issue. This is not a people issue. It's a system issue. And so for
Yeah.
to be safe places, the system needs dismantling. And it is probably
Yes.
not going to be us on the outside of the church that dismantles that. It needs to be the people who are standing in front of a congregation on a Sunday, and the church members who try to dismantle that system of harm. So, yeah, I think that advocacy part is a really key part in how queerness becomes safe in those spaces. And sadly, I think we are a very long way away from that, but there are people who are trying their hardest to start that process.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Okay, so I'm going to twist my final question that I ask everybody in these episodes, um, which is, what would you say to somebody who is deep in their deconstruction or deep in their religious trauma? But I would love you to answer it in particular to queer people who are deep in their deconstruction, or who are trying to heal, and repair and unravel that dissonance that they have felt in their church communities.
Be gentle with yourself and
Mm.
practice self compassion. And that can look like whatever that may be for you that causes you to light up, that causes you to feel some self soothing. Because in going through this process is a very tough process to be
Mm.
going through. And so I just want to encourage folks going through it to offer yourself some extra tender, loving care.
Mm. Yeah, I love that. I think self-compassion is so key and so crucial. So, in any sort of healing, but in particular in this space. Yeah, I love that. Thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
It's been a wonderful conversation.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Beyond the Surface. I hope you found today's conversation as insightful and inspiring as I did. If you enjoyed the episode, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with others who might benefit from these stories. Stay connected with us on social media for updates and more content. I love connecting with all of you. Remember, no matter where you are in your journey, you're not alone. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep moving forward. Take care.